So that's what we're going to have a look at today is like a little bit of where we've been from this idea of establishing a contract or a protocol whenever we're building out applications to these myriad of different protocols that are quickly coming on the scene, like MCP and agent to agent. Really describing the way that these different systems are going to interact here as we move forward in the future, right? So what we've seen is a big shift, right? I mean, if we go back, honestly, 2-3 years ago, the whole concept of even talking about agentic AI applications and agent development was a pretty novel concept. Honestly, we weren't hearing a lot of people talking about it. And it's coming with the advent, obviously, of large language models becoming a little bit more consumable. Having some competition in the space certainly, which drives the price down, makes it a little bit easier for us to go and actually start building these applications that can leverage these generative AI capabilities. So it's been a natural evolution, right, where it's like, okay, we've started leveraging GenAI to build out some of these new digital experiences, right, naturally into the space of like, okay, how can we start hooking them up with real data and actually generate meaningful experiences, right, leveraging these generative AI systems. So it's been a pretty big shift, and we're caught up in the middle of it right now. And really what that shift is like, if we look over the past couple of decades, right, there was a big movement from really just like going straight to a database, for example, and to establish contracts and establish designs for how developers are meant to go and communicate with different systems as they build out applications, right? So you had these APIs that were designed for the devs, right? Now, as we're building out agents, obviously, they're going to need to have the ability to consume and compose and orchestrate many different API calls to satisfy their workflows and different tasks that they're setting out to achieve there. So how do we prepare for this transition? Now, just a quick note on what's supported there today from really the standard that most every organization out there has adopted, that being OpenAPI, right? So there's a standardized way to actually establish a contract and really describe the services that are available for a given organization. Now, for most use cases, it's like how do different teams discover what's available, what's on the shelf, how can we promote reuse rather than wild rebuilding across the organization. And we've obviously evolved into the ability to go and expose APIs as well and make sure that we have a standardized contract for how external consumers and partners can come in and in real time, in a predictable way, grab data from a given app or service that organization exposes. So it promotes universal documentation, discovery, and tooling. And obviously, from a developer's perspective, it has gone a long way with building that developer ecosystem and making it super easy for devs to get up and running when building different applications, right? However, there are some limitations, right? It comes down to strict versioning, making sure that whenever you're going and making an update to a given API that you might have exposed by your organization, you need to do so in a measured way. You can't necessarily just commit to production, right, and go ahead and wildly change the experience that these different applications are expecting to have when they're going to consume the APIs, right? So there's somewhat rigid schemas, and it doesn't necessarily account for semantic context, right? And so far, that's been a good thing, right? If you've ever been in the engineering space, having a rigid schema is actually fantastic, especially if you're building like a user interface, so you can predictably know that whatever you're trying to show on the screen is actually, you're going to have the right data there to show it, right? But obviously some limitations there. Poor semantic context, no intent-based reasoning for the actual data that's going to be shipped back to you. So now what we're entering into is what I like to refer to as protocol proliferation, right? So it's new ways to talk, right, between these different systems and applications that are being built. And the first one, right, that we've seen over the past year and a half now is the advent of MCP. So it's Model Context Protocol, right? And it's a protocol for how agents can dynamically go and source data, right? So an agent is only as good as the context that it has when it's going and leveraging these different models to either execute workflows, tasks, or just to ship experiences. The classic example, right, is you'll work with many different organizations. Seemingly the primary use case for a lot of them is like, how can we ship a context-aware chatbot and make it available to folks in our contact center, for example. Previously, we had this chatbot experience where if before the idea of being able to get live context. Let's say you're working at a bank and you need to quickly be able to triage some transactions that are going on either on a credit card or in a customer's checking account. Really, the customer might go integrate with a chatbot, right? They get some basic data back, not a whole lot, and they end up getting dumped into a queue where, they might actually be, having to wait 30 minutes, an hour, whatever it might be to speak with an actual agent. Now, what we're seeing in more of a modern agentic world is where you can actually ship some intelligent experiences directly in those chatbots that are being made available to customers, where they can actually ask intelligent questions about what's happening in the transaction history, start building a general overview of what's going on in their accounts. On the flip side, in contact center, equally, you have that ability where you can ship those experiences where folks that are helping out customers can quickly source the data they need without necessarily having to go down a bunch of different avenues to source it, right? So MCP gives that agent-native, lightweight, and context-rich protocol, and really achieving that idea of securing real-time context whenever you're going and leveraging these GenAI systems to power the workflows. Now, that's not without challenges, right? So, what we're seeing out there is there are some rather fragmented implementations. If you go back over the existence of MCP, right, you'll see for a substantial amount of time, the whole idea of hosting a remote MCP server was not necessarily a thing, right? It was all operating of standard I/O. It certainly could be help if you're building and shipping an agent as a composable package where it can have these tool sets and execute them at runtime, over the process. But it was deviating from this idea of like, hey, I'm an application team that wants to ship an experience that other folks within my organization or perhaps outside the org can actually easily come in and consume as we build out our applications, right? There's also a bit of a lack of standards around like the actual governance and authentication protocols as being applied to MCP level. They obviously have, for example, an Auth 2 spec out there today for how you can drive authorization directly in the server. But from this idea of it being fragmented and complete, you'll see if you pay attention to the spec that they change it on almost a bi-weekly basis. So much so, like I think it was last week, they actually changed the spec to remove a core component of it where, they were basically proclaiming that anybody coming in and authorizing to an MCP server had to present the resource representing the tool that they were looking to consume. And come to find out, none of the identity providers out there actually support that yet or have the facility to support that here anytime soon in the near future, right? So it's just an example of how, the official protocol itself is undergoing rapid change on almost a weekly basis. And for organizations that are looking to actually roll this out in production, it presents a challenge, right? Because if you don't have like an actual standard that you can build against, or if you don't have any predictability on the stability of that standard, how can you actually drive standards as you're building out your platform internally? It makes it rather difficult. Likewise, there's still not great standardizations out there for not just Auth in, Auth Z, but the observability side of things. There's a number of different solutions available, but there's no tried and true standard to actually go and instrument all the way from, say, an agent like in the code, through a large language model across to all of the different tool calls that large language model might be executing, right? So really what that nets out to is the dev ecosystem is still in the early stages, right? There's a number of different tools that are being developed, great tools to make it easier to build out these agentic experiences. But if I was a developer today, it's like, where do you start? And how can you actually build a secure and responsible application as you're rolling this out? Now, naturally, when we talk about agent development, right, MCP covers the context side of it. But we're moving quickly into a space where you're building out agents, autonomous or prompt-based, right? They're going to need to have some ability to go and communicate with each other, right? So they'll need to actually be able to delegate different tasks and workflows and make sure that each individual agent knows the status of a task that might be executed on another agent, right? So it's moving a little bit beyond the idea of just calling like a point-to-point interaction with like a regular API and rather understanding in an autonomous fashion the state of workflows that are being executed, tasks that are available, understanding all the different tools that these different systems can leverage as they interact with one another, right? So we're seeing it across a number of different verticals, which I find to be pretty interesting. Namely though, like in travel and supply chain and finance, right? We're really seeing this idea of like how can we build for example, an agent that's going to be assessing risk on credit applications in an autonomous fashion, have that feedback loop of what the status of risk factors are on each of the applications, and having the ability for folks to actually go natively hook into those systems in real time as they're firing away, rather than having necessarily a human in the loop. It's there's some interesting problems that are being solved out there. Obviously, but again, it's not without its challenges, right? So when we think about the current protocol for how agents are communicating with one another, right? It still has that same problem of like, how can the agents predictably verify who they're interacting with? If there is a human in the loop, right? How are they actually able to go and trigger consent for those users to make sure that they're not going to go off and run wild and have access to data that they shouldn't have access to, right? How can we standardize the actual trust contracts and the policies that are being executed whenever these agents are interfacing with one another? What you might see is it's more complex than like traditional API exposure. It's more complex than saying, hey, for a given endpoint that's exposed on this API, there's a very specific scope that's needed. That still exists in some capacity here in an agentic world and MCP, right? But it's getting a little bit more complex because you have these layers of abstraction that are really acting as a different interface for consuming those backend APIs that are sourcing the data. So again, I think what you'll see too is just from the developer ecosystem, both in MCP, also in agent development, there's a distinct lack in any standardization on how both they can handle authentication, authorization protocols, but also govern the transactions that are happening between these different systems. So, with all of these different protocols, those are just a couple. There's obviously MCP, A2A, there's different flavors like agent communication protocol out there from Microsoft, right? Really what comes next here? Like, how can we actually have a more formalized process for building out these agentic applications and knowing that we can actually ship responsible experiences to our dev teams, right? Because, it's the name of the game. If we're going to leverage some of the efficiencies that have come with the AI space, we've got to do so in a responsible way, right? So, and we talk about this internally at Kong all the time. Are we going to converge on one universal protocol to interact with all these different systems? Or are we still going to have these protocol wars from like the different providers, right? And that's, if you read between the lines, right, there's a vested interest out there for Google to keep proliferating and propagating, evangelizing agent to agent. There's a vested interest in Anthropic maintaining the model context protocol and making sure that kind of lives in its own thing, obviously open source, but primarily run by Anthropic, right? Or are we just going to have a polyglot world where these are all going to coexist and we really have to hone in on the standards that each one of these different entities is going to interact with one another, right? So if you think about some like open questions, you've heard me mention it both in MCP and the A2A space, right? Identity and authentication. How can we standardize who's coming in, who's making these requests, be it a machine, like an actual agent that's coming in, or if they're doing it on behalf of a user? How can we standardize that across the space, across all of these different systems? From a developer experience perspective, how can we make sure that they're going from an actual just like software developer style experience to actually designing these agents in a responsible way? It becomes a little bit less about say the code, right? Because we have agent toolkits that facilitate a lot of these, and you have people out there vibe coding and taking advantage of all the tool sets that are available. How can we have developers go and shift more about understanding all the different data that's being exchanged, the different contracts that are in place between these different entities, and making sure that there's no data leakages, right? And that we're taking advantage of these awesome tools in a responsible way. And likewise, lifecycle management. If you think about OpenAPI, it's rather simple. Do you have different versions? When a new version comes out, it usually means there's a change of the contract. How do we actually handle that in an MCP and an agent-to-agent world? Now, you get some advantages leveraging large language models because they can natively understand dynamically like structures of different tool calls or parameters that are available, perhaps different agents that need to be interacted with. But it's a completely different world when you think about it from a developer and documentation point of view. How do you make sure everything stays up to date and the developers know how they can go and interact with these different systems? So there is a way, right? And when it comes to unifying APIs in the agentic era, what we believe here at Kong is, API gateways, not a new concept, right? But they do a great job of eliminating some of these cross-cutting concerns that I've called out on the previous slides here with these different protocols. We can expose models and APIs and services alike. We can standardize on the authentication and authorization policies and frameworks that these agents will use to actually go and consume data. Act as that single entry point for governance for platform teams that want to make sure that applications that are being built are staying within regulatory compliance. And comprehensive observability across the board. So no matter what type of system you're actually exposing, you just get observability for free, right? So with Kong Gateway, I know we're running a little bit short on time here, so I'm not going to go through every capability that exists, but we have a pluggable architecture, right, that covers each of these different areas of concern. From an AI gateway perspective, we provide the ability to go and natively interact and connect the models directly from the gateway in a secure and governable way, right? So not just a networking piece and mediating that authentication to make sure that no developer is going out of compliance, but we have that ability to actually apply guardrails as well to make sure that the actual content coming through the systems is keeping up with compliance. For example, leveraging PI sanitization to make sure in those sensitive use cases that we're not actually blasting consumer and customer data out there to the large language models. We also, for free, get the observability and audit trails out of the box there, where we can take existing observability systems and enrich the actual logs, metrics, and traces that we're already propagating to those systems with information relevant to those AI interactions, right? Be it with LLMs, integrating with MCPs, even calls between agents, right? Now, the next thing that we have to offer here on the Kong side of things is that innovation platform, right? So the runtime itself and how we're actually going and securing access and governing access between agents and MCP servers, between MCP servers, making those tool calls to upstream APIs. That's something we do very well from a runtime perspective. But as you might see, right, from a developer ecosystem, if you're a new developer joining any of your organizations, you need to actually have the facility to get up to speed with all the different tools that are available, but also how to go to integrate with different systems. Having a tight platform that has the ability to document where all of these different resources are located and how to integrate with them is going to become even more important. Again, we're moving on beyond the OpenAPI spec world where it's rather straightforward to say, here's one way to actually integrate with these REST APIs. And instead, the developers are going to need to know how to integrate with each of these different systems as they build out their agents. Right? So that's where Konnect comes into play, right? So we have that control plane layer on top of our federated runtimes that allow us to take these secure and governed applications that we're exposing via the gateway, and we can actually start documenting where all these different resources are running, how to integrate with them. Accounting for not just OpenAPI specifications, but going and documenting how to integrate with MCP. What the tools that are available. How can we register for access to consume those MCP servers. For agents, what tasks are available with those agents? What is needed to actually authenticate and be authorized to consume the different tasks that an agent might be consuming or exposing? So, we have, what we believe here at Kong is that we have, that comprehensive ability, right, that not just secure and govern at a runtime perspective, all of these different applications that are going to be exposed, but also make it super easy for dev teams within these different organizations to get up and running and start building with speed, the AI native applications. So, that's really it. I know we probably have 5 minutes left or so. About 5 minutes left or so. So, the future's coming. And the question is, how ready are we? So I want to open up here to see if anybody had any questions about MCP, agents, A2A, Kong in general.
Any questions?
Anybody?
Yes, there's one right here.
So for A2A, I'm not super familiar with A2A yet, but are you also sending the traffic between these agents through the gateway and then securing and authenticating all that traffic?
Yeah, so, and that's a good question, right? So with both MCP and A2A, it's all predicated on operating over the HTTP protocol, right? So at the end of the day, it's exposing some combination of the ability to send post requests to either execute tasks in the agent world or execute tool calls, right, in the MCP world. And then this ability to subscribe to each of these entities, agents, and MCP servers, and have the results stream back, right? It could be results from a tool call. It could be notifications that are emitted either from MCP or agents, right? It's all operating of the HTTP protocol, which is a perfect use case for putting a gateway to get that instant observability for what's happening between the different entities, right? So that's the nice thing operating on HTTP. You get a lot of these capabilities for free by having a gateway in the mix.
Other questions? Yes.
Are the authentication authorization mechanisms are fully flushed out for these agents, like, whether it be MCP or API, or is it still in the flux state right now?
It's still in a state of flux right now. Like I said, we took MCP for an example, right, where they're constantly changing the actual spec for authorization within if you're building like Auth 2 bindings within the MCP servers. Because there's a number of interesting problems that need to be accounted for. If you think about like tool calls or tasks, so tasks on the agents, tool calls, and MCP servers, how do we actually go about authorizing access to them? That's an area that's completely incomplete from the authorization protocol right now. We know about Auth 2 and the idea of scopes being applied to different endpoints, right? And that's a very normal thing in a RESTful API world. It's rather incomplete, though, from an MCP and agent development perspective, right? So the idea is that, having Kong in the mix, we actually provide plugins that will allow you to enforce Kong to be a proxying Auth 2 resource server. So you can actually have that in between, say an agent that might be calling an MCP server, and be able to interrogate that request that's coming through and make sure that we're driving both authentication from the agent to the MCP, but also we can do things like scope-based authorizations based on different endpoints or tools that are being accessed.
There was a question back here.
Mine was a similar question. I think enforcement of scopes from OAuth 2
Yep.
to especially PII, PHI data, that's a challenge. And I don't know if you have.
Within the scope of accessing PI or PHI data, or
Enforcing the scope, right?
yeah. So like with a tool call, making sure that a given application can actually interact with something that might have confidential or customer data, right?
So PHI is
Yep.
much more relevant. And then how you control the scope for the agent because we were having trouble enforcing the scope control on APIs.
Yep.
Now we have agents which are much more.
So that's part of the spec is effectively, this is play the question back. How can we enable agents both to understand the scopes that are needed to access, PII and PHI data that might be existing in a tool call, and how can we also govern, that access as well, right? So, that is part of the spec. Is if you look at OAuth 2.1, acting as a resource server, understanding, hey, I'm an agent, I need to call a tool that might be running on an MCP server, understanding what resources are available and what scopes are needed to actually, consume each of those resources. That's something that's actively, being designed in the spec for like MCP right now. Internally here at Kong, what we're looking at is in the future, as this stuff starts to firm up, how can we abstract that away where, if we are in a state where the authorization protocol, the scope protocol, it's continuously changing in the MCP, how can we abstract that away and actually handle that at the gateway layer, right? So today we have that ability, which Marco just announced at the keynote this morning, to actually go and expose MCP servers natively via the gateway. And so the natural evolution of that is being able to inspect that RPC payload when tool calls are being made, and then actually start driving authorizations based on things like tool calls and scopes that might exist in the token that's being passed.